Thank you very much. Good morning.
Good morning.
I'm just going to try and put this technology into this machine and look at that, brilliant, it works. Good morning. I hope my talk is understandable. I'll try and speak clearly and hopefully you can hear, and please ask questions of people in the room who can translate if I'm not clear. But this morning I'm going to talk about the principles of agroforestry and some of the things that I've learnt in the 20 years that I've been involved with agroforestry, both on my own farm and elsewhere. So I'm a farmer. I farm in England, in the United Kingdom. I also run a consultancy business, and I'm head of soils for our Royal Agricultural Society. So I wear one hat on a Monday and a different hat on a Tuesday and a different hat on a Wednesday, like all farmers do. Wonderful, it's been translated. I can't remember what I was writing. I've got it here just in case. As you can see, these are the things I'm going to talk about in terms of, there you go. So why is agroforestry different? What's the impact it has on resources? A little bit about silvo-arable and silvo-pastoral systems. And then this afternoon, we'll talk about more of our own experiences on our own farms. So we all know that there are more pressures on our environment. Populations globally are increasing. There are pressures for food, for housing, for energy. There is a lot of demands on our land and on us as farmers. And we know that climate change is starting to impact the way that we farm. I see myself, I expect you also see bigger periods of wet, bigger periods of dry, and we've got to farm in a way which is more resilient to climate change. In our newspapers now we see articles on soil, which we didn't see 20 years ago. So we're seeing this becoming more important within the conversation of policymakers and within the newspapers and within media. We have issues, so in the UK, we have some issues with organic matter in our soils and the amount of carbon that has been removed from the soils. We've seen long-term declines in soil organic carbon, which is a concern for the long-term resilience of our soils. Probably the most frightening component of this was the date on this table, which is 1985, which is the last time our government invested in understanding carbon levels in our soil. So we're driving a car with a blindfold and no map. So it's a bit unknown. But in many ways, our agriculture has been good at being very productive, but we've been emptying the bank account in terms of carbon in our soils. So we need to think about how we energize our soils in a better way, which has got me thinking about agroforestry. Because our soils function as a soil food web, and at the top of that soil food web is photosynthetic activity and photosynthesis and bringing carbon into the system, which then the fungi and the bacteria and the nematodes and springtails and protozoas and the smaller soil organisms then all eat in turn. But the key is about getting carbon into the system, and this is what made me start thinking about agroforestry. Charles Darwin said that the earthworm is the ecosystem engineer, and that ecosystem engineer relies upon that carbon source to improve the soil quality and multiply the nutrients. But in order for these livestock, because as farmers, even though some of us only farm crops, we all farm livestock. It's just that most of the livestock are under our feet, and we need to feed that livestock like any other form of livestock with a mixture of carbohydrate and protein, and the carbohydrate comes from the organic carbon that goes into the soil, and the protein comes from the fungi and the bacteria which eat that carbon, which then form a balanced diet for the earthworms. So it's all part of this ecosystem that we have to try and understand. As farmers, the challenges we face are that I asked the question that is high input monoculture still the model, is it fit for purpose as we move forward? Inputs are becoming more expensive and less available through legislation, but we've got to increase productivity and farm the environment better and have more biodiversity. These are many things that are being asked for us to do as farmers, and that's quite a difficult challenge. And in its simplest form, as a farmer, my job is to harvest sunlight, mix it with water and carbon dioxide, and turn it into carbon-based products which I can either sell or I can feed to animals. That's the job I do. And what got me thinking was that when we look at, so this is UK potential sunlight hours, so winter, summer. If we look at cereal production as an example, there is a period of the year when we're near maximum solar radiation, but we're not building new carbon. Whether we are a forester or a farmer or a solar engineer, we're all in the same job. But in this instance, we've turned the solar panels off. So how do we keep the solar panels turned on to keep more energy coming into the soil and build more carbon? And this started me thinking about how nature does it, with different species growing all year round and different spatial arrangements, and started me thinking about agroforestry. Because nature doesn't do monoculture ever. It's worked out a long time ago that if it has different plants in different places and space and in different times of the year, always photosynthesizing, it is always pulling energy into the system. So this got me thinking about agroforestry about 15 years ago, and wondering if trees could form part of an agricultural system, and could agroforestry be an alternative approach to agriculture. And the challenge in many ways is that it's not agriculture and it's not forestry, it's a hybrid system between the two, taking the best of forestry and the best of agriculture and trying to create a system that works. So we've got, I should have moved the thing here, but in Finland you've got a lot of trees. In the UK we have not so many trees. So we're slightly different in terms of our landscape, but we have targets to try and increase the tree cover, and in the UK actually it means that the only place we can put trees is on agricultural land. The context will be slightly different here in Finland, that you have more tree cover and less agricultural land as a total land mass, but there's still opportunities to think about how the two integrate. It's not a new idea. This is a picture from France near Le Mans in the 1900s, and you can see a very different landscape. And part of the reason here is that with the Common Agricultural Policy, when this was started in the 1940s and 50s, the regulations said that if you had more than 50 trees per hectare on a parcel of land, this ceased to be agriculture, it became forestry. So farmers responded and removed trees to make it eligible for agricultural support. Today we've been able to modify the Common Agricultural Policy, and it now recognises that if you can carry on agricultural activity, it can still have trees in the parcels and still be eligible for agricultural support. So agroforestry excuse me, is a hybrid system, and it's trying to take the best of forestry and the best of agriculture, and build upon the complementary components to get the best out of the land use and farming system. One of the key lessons for me learning about agroforestry was how we can use resources, nutrients, water, sunlight at different times of the year. So a cereal or arable crop might use sunlight from the start of the year until the middle of the summer, when it is then dying in the field, senescing, going golden and drying, whereas the trees tend to start much later in the season, and they still have leaves now and are still photosynthesizing right through to the late autumn. So there's an overlap here in space, which means we keep the solar panels turned on for a longer period of time. Also about space. So as a farmer, most of my farm I don't own. I pay a rental on the farm from the landowner, but I want to make the farm bigger and more productive. But most of us as farmers think in a fairly two-dimensional way. If we add trees to or we have trees in our farming systems, we become three-dimensional farmers. And the farm can be made bigger by farming up and farming down, deeper into the soil and more into the air, and it's free. I don't have to pay the bank any more money. I don't have to pay my landlord any more money, because I'm becoming a three-dimensional farmer. But the challenge for most of us is I have skills as a farmer but not as a forester, or I have skills as a forester and not as a farmer. So we have to blend these skills to create an agroforestry system. Most farmers are interested in either livestock or crops. Most foresters are interested in trees, and we have a different skill set. And most farmers have arborphobia, and most foresters have agrophobia, and we have to overcome this illness to try and progress agroforestry. We also have other complications for the UK at the moment. We're not quite sure what's happening in our place in Europe at the moment, so we have some complications in terms of policy, but agroforestry has been part of the Common Agricultural Policy for some time, in terms of providing grants for planting and adoption and management. In the UK, our government chose not to adopt those measures and make them available to farmers, which has been a challenge, but in other countries, member states, they have been available. I've got to remember what this says now. From my perspective in the UK, we have some issues that we have a big proportion of our land which is owned and rented, and this makes agroforestry more challenging because it's a long-term project, and doing this on land that you do not own can sometimes be a difficult challenge. But there are some good examples now where we have landowners who have created agreements with one or two parties where maybe they rent land to a farmer who does the farming, and they rent the tree components to another operator who then manages the fruit or the timber or the nuts in the same field area. So we have two farmers operating in the same field with different skills. The other challenge we have is different departments. We have a forestry commission, and we have an agriculture department, and we have environmental departments. They all speak a slightly different language, but with trees and with soils and with agriculture and with animals and crops, we're having to bring all these together, which is a challenge. But it's for the first time, in some ways for us, Brexit is an opportunity, because we're starting to have to build our own agricultural policies or land policies. So these departments are coming together. So for me, it's an opportunity with agroforestry. On climate change, there are the Paris obligations in terms of reducing climate change and greenhouse gas emissions. And we did some calculations earlier in the year. The requirements were to plant trees in England, and we've been underperforming. We've planted very few trees in terms of area that we should have done. With 72% of our area as farmland, agroforestry really is the only way we were going to have trees integrated into the landscape. And the calculations we've done would suggest that just to change to 5.8% of the land area, of agricultural area, with trees as part of agroforestry, could completely realise or meet our climate change obligations under the Paris Agreement, which is not a big change. And 5.8 is quite important because this afternoon when I show you my farm, we've got 8%. So we're well above what we would need to realise a climate change obligation under the Paris Agreement. So it requires a bit of a shift in thinking and a shift in the way that we do things. And one of the biggest challenges for us at the moment is our political leaders. Our two main political parties in the UK, getting them to understand agroforestry. It shouldn't be difficult because one of them has a tree in its logo. Anyhow, this is a challenge. So we need to think about how agroforestry works and the components and what makes it perform better. In France, there was a lot of work done over many decades looking at not only above ground growth of agroforestry, but the impact below ground of rooting. And one of the other things that made me really appreciate the benefits of agroforestry was some of this work. These are poplar trees. They'd be about 20 years old. The tree on the left is from a forest plantation, and the tree on the right is from an agroforestry system, just only 10 meters apart, so next to each other. And the roots are very different. And the reason for this is that in a forest situation, the roots come to the surface because this is where the nutrients and water are. In an agroforestry situation, because there is either a crop or grass which wakes up from its winter sleep early and uses the water and the nutrients, when the tree wakes up later, there's no food. So the tree has to go looking for deeper roots in the soil, with deeper roots looking for food and water, because it's compartmentalized, segmented where these resources are being used. If as a farmer you're using tillage as part of the system, then maybe there is also some root cutting as well, and this is training or pruning the roots below ground, and also changing where the roots go. So one of the key aspects of why agroforestry is different from forestry is that we're actually modifying rooting patterns below ground as well as plant space above ground. In terms of biodiversity, we've been looking at home, we've been looking at work on biodiversity, looking at pollinators and insects and invertebrates. This is just some results of a trial back in 2009 to 11, which is being repeated again now with a PhD student. And this is my own farm here, but there was a number of farms. And in most cases, the biodiversity and the abundance and distribution of that biodiversity is greater in an agroforestry system because you're creating more diversity in terms of land and crop use, and creating, importantly, lots of edge between different environments, and most of the biodiversity happens at a change or at the edge of an environment. Other work that's been done, this is work from Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, by Jim McAdam, and he looked at grassland ash agroforestry and ash woodland, and again you can see more abundance of spiders, birds and beetles in the agroforestry compared to woodland forestry or straight grassland, because it's a hybrid system. So when we're thinking about how we farm going in the future, about how we might be able to reduce our reliance on pesticides, perhaps agroforestry can offer some of the answers in terms of providing habitat for beneficial insects, which can then, those beneficial predator insects can help manage some of the pest problems within our cropping systems and land use systems. There is a role for agroforestry in terms of environmental protection, actually establishing windbreaks and shelter belts in field edges to filter sediment and fertilizers and pollutants into watercourses. There's been some, this is actually a picture from Canada, where there's legislation to require tree planting, especially in areas with livestock, to help filter sediments and pollutants and manures from getting into watercourses, and the trees acting as buffers. But perhaps we can use trees to help mitigate in catchments with climate change, where we're seeing greater rainfall events, to slow the water flow, to increase infiltration and reduce flooding, and that's by stabilising soils around riparian areas and reducing that water flow, especially on sloping ground, and helping that infiltration with those deeper roots. So there's an environmental role as well. The question I'm asked often, though, is how is the productivity of agroforestry? This is a picture of actually almond trees and wheat in France in an agroforestry system. But the first thing to think about is that one of the things that agroforestry does is it changes the microclimate. In the middle of winter, would you prefer to go and stand in the middle of a field where it may be colder, or would you prefer to go and stand in a forest area where maybe it's a little warmer, the wind is slower? So the trees can actually help modify the microclimate by firstly protecting the soil, secondly reducing wind speed, which reduces evaporation. If you're managing livestock, it keeps it warmer, which means the livestock grow rather than putting energy into keeping warm. And in the summer, especially as we're getting hotter summers, it reduces the evaporation, the evapotranspiration from crops from wind. We find in the UK we're in a very windy environment, probably more so than in mainland Europe, similar to Finland. But the summer we get a lot of strong winds, and that can reduce evapotranspiration and water loss. My own experience on my own farm this year was that in the middle of August we had 2 days of 100-kilometre-an-hour winds, which caused some real damage to some crops. In the open field areas, we had 20% loss of grain from the grain threshing and ending up on the floor. In the agroforestry area, we only had 10% losses because the wind speed was reduced and the threshing of the grain was reduced. We like to think that agriculture is becoming more efficient with nutrient use and nitrogen especially. Some work done by the French So they're getting some minerals or some nutrition from the leaves that they're not getting from the grass. So perhaps we can provide that. And there's some quite good research data on that coming now. There are, with the cropping systems, we can use either fruits and nuts, we can use biomass. This is my friend's farm in France with the Yuglins, the walnut and the cereals. This is my own farm in the UK. The important thing is that we must be able to use modern farm machinery so that we can mechanise the systems, because this is important for most farmers, because labour is expensive and it's sometimes difficult to get. So just a few pictures of different agroforestry systems. The challenge for us as land managers is to think about timescales, because the rotation of the grass or the arable crop is an annual crop. The trees are a long-term crop. So these might be planted in 97 right through to 2009 here, before we start doing the first thinning and harvesting. So it's a longer time scale, but we can use the agroforestry systems for designing them for soil protection, helping placing soils in the right place to reduce soil degradation. We can think about how the trees intercept wind and slow down wind at ground level. One of the things that I hadn't recognised is that farmers that are farming with agroforestry can spray with fertilisers and chemicals more days, because the wind between the trees is reduced. Therefore, there are more days that one can go into the field and, as a conventional farmer, and spray, do their spraying practices because of that reduced wind speed. So that's a bonus. In terms of light interception, the work that's been done has been looking in different places in the world, looking at orientation and spatial distribution of trees, looking at light interception, and in general, in a northern latitude like we are here, if you were creating an alley cropping system, you'd want to try and orientate the trees as near north-south as possible, so the sun comes up in the east and down in the west, which means you minimise shading. If you plant them east-west, you'll always have a shaded side in the winter. Okay. Also, tree management and pruning is very important. So there's been quite a lot of work on looking at how we prune trees to different heights, and that has an impact both north, south and east, west on light interception. So careful management of the tree is important, and also the right planting orientation. So when establishing these systems, you need to think about when the trees are mature and how much shade they might impart. If they're planted too close together, when the trees get big, too much shading, the productivity of the grass or the crop reduces. So you need to have the right orientation. This is again my friend's farm in France, a conventional farm with the walnuts, the juglans, and is a conventional farm, but he applies no nitrogen fertilizer for more than a decade, because all the fertilizer is the leaf litter from the trees, which the worms then bring back into the soil, which then create the fertilizer.
Joo, mä tiedoksi, että löytyy suomalainen sanakin tälle pähkinälle, eli kastanja. Eli olet joku teistä siellä tiesi. Ei saksan pähkinä. Mitä? Saksan pähkinä. Okei, sorry. Mä sekoilen. Hei.
So there are roles for using, these are farms near me, but this is a farm in Germany. There are roles for using trees for windbreaks to help improve the local microclimate. And there are, in our environment in the UK, we're largely an agroforestry system anyhow, because we have a lot of hedgerows and tree belts, but farmers don't value these. They value them for biodiversity, but not for economics and income. So we need to think about how we can manage these tree belts and hedgerows better. We've also done a lot of work over a number of decades in Scotland, looking at, in an upland system, looking at different densities and planting arrangements for agroforestry in upland environments, and the provision of shelter and reducing or increasing temperatures in the winter and providing shade in the summer really increases the productivity of livestock, because they're not so stressed. They put more energy into growing rather than keeping warm or keeping cool. So we've been looking at it in terms of riparian management and landscape scale systems. I know you've only got 10 minutes, so I'll keep 5 minutes. Okay. 7, okay. There are opportunities for things like poultry in agroforestry systems. Poultry are a woodland fowl. They're an Asian woodland fowl. We've taken poultry and taken them out of that environment and put them in buildings, in pasture with no trees. We have a system in the UK called woodland eggs, so that the birds now have better health, less predation, less pecking when they've got trees as part of their environment, and the eggs are now marketed as woodland eggs for a premium as a free range system. So that's been a great success. Opportunities for things like nuts, timber, biomass production, also perhaps even maybe as being English we're obsessed by cricket. But maybe we can make sports equipment or etc. from it. We could do agronomy. There are lots of things to think about in terms of agronomy, in terms of the type of trees that you might be planting and whether they've got with livestock. It doesn't have to be a tree. This is maybe in perhaps warmer climates, but these are some annual species. So this is camelina under agroforestry with coconuts. This is elderflower and elderberry used as part of an agroforestry system. So it's pasture and elderflower and elderberry. But you need to think about, there's lots of things to think about in terms of tree choice. And I think these presentations are being made available to all of you, so I'm not going to spend too much time. You can go back and look at these. There are lots of things you need to think about tree choice, and also tree species selection, about different trees to fit the agroecological system in which you're farming, whether it's in southern Finland or northern Finland. You're going to have different temperature and rainfall zones. So finding the right trees to suit those. But the market is really important as well within this. Where are you going to sell the tree products at the end? In terms of crop choice, as I said, could be that it's livestock driving the system that you want to design. It could be crop production in different forms, or forage production. It could be a different system depending on what you're trying to achieve. When you're establishing those trees, it's important to get the soil conditions correct. So any drainage problems, any structural problems should be put right before those trees are established. And one needs to think about getting the very best quality tree components for planting in terms of starting them on a good journey, especially if you're looking for timber trees. One of the issues around guarding and good tree management will be the same for forestry, so making sure there are appropriate tree guards, or in this case vole guards from the little voles that come from underneath, to minimise damage. There are plenty of systems around Europe which have planted alley cropping systems that are operating dairy or beef systems using electric fencing to keep the cows off the trees in their early years. When the trees get bigger, it's not really a problem. they look after themselves. Early year protection from weed management, either through using a mulch mat or herbicides, need to be thought about, as does the correct guarding and staking. You need to think about how you're going to manage the understory of trees, whether that's done with machinery or whether it's left to grow wildflowers and pollen species and planted, or whether it's using herbicides. And thinking about also perhaps using mulch, tree mulch or bark in the base to provide a good nutrient source and weed control in the early years. So there are different methods of using geotextiles or in this case carpet, jute, hessian, or straw or wood mulch, or even perhaps even livestock. It's amazing how effective chickens are at reducing weeds. They'll eat everything. No minutes. Is that 0 minutes? 0 minutes. Okay, I'll be very quick. Obviously, as farmers, we can use chemical control. I'm an organic farmer, so this isn't an option for me, but there are plenty of vineyard type machinery that can use chemical control for keeping weed suppression down. The only piece of machinery I had to buy on my farm was this small mower, just to mow around the trees and keep the weed management. But other farmers have used either textile mats or compost or wood chip for the same purpose. An important thing, though, as I mentioned earlier on, is actually management of the trees below ground and above ground, and actually training and managing the roots and doing some root pruning is really a really important part of agroforestry to make the trees do what you want them to do and be productive. Okay, let's finish there. Other than just to say pest control is really important. Whether it's pigeons or deer or birds, think about how you're going to manage pests, especially in the early years when the trees are quite prone to that damage. I'll stop there because I'm under pressure. Questions? Is there questions?